Hello! It's another glorious autumn morning in Gothenburg, and today I'm going to talk to you about the DRY principle, or when I think that you should apply the DRY principle, and a little bit of it's something I at least struggled with when I started out programming and I was being taught about it. So let's define the DRY principle first. So the DRY principle is don't repeat yourself. That's what it stands for. And the idea is that instead of copy pasting, which happens a lot, sometimes, at least sometimes it happens, you find a piece of logic or a piece of code where you need basically to move that piece of code somewhere else. You need it, or something very, very similar to it. And the suggestion, or the DRY principle, means that instead of copy pasting code, you should never copy paste code. You should instead try to rewrite the code that you already have in a more generic fashion so that it is reusable and it fits your new use case. That being said, there is a few, that's a very loose kind of definition of how this is supposed to work. And more than once, I have found myself in this situation where code duplication actually is, following the DRY principle will absolutely give you that, you will be able to follow that rule, and you will be able to provide value to the project. However, the trade-off is that you will break a few other rules, because sometimes the DRY principle, in my opinion, kind of has to be broken, because the problem that you're solving, or maybe it's just me being a simpleton, but the problem is that you will break other rules. There are other rules that, or principles, such as, for example, keep it simple, stupid, and rules such as loose coupling, like prefer loose coupling if possible. So what's loose coupling? Well, loose coupling is the idea that you create code that is easy to change, and it doesn't that's not so tightly coupled to different parts of the system, so that you can update it or remove it or substitute it for something else. And these are very high level terms, but in essence the same thing goes for keep it simple, stupid. So what happens when you find a piece of code that is very similar, at least what I do usually, is that I'll find a function or something like that, and I'll be working and I'll see that, oh, this function over here, or this abstraction over here, is very similar to this thing over here. Maybe I could rewrite that in a more generic fashion and save myself a few lines of code. That's a bad idea. I've learned that the hard way. That is a very bad idea, and it's kind of what prompted this entire video. And the point I'm making is that there's a subtle difference between code that feels the same and code that should have the DRY principle. As an example, in JavaScript, it's a great example. If we want a concrete example of the DRY principle and when you should use the DRY principle. Let's say that you're creating a bunch of filtering functions, and in that those filtering functions, you have an object and there's a key on that object, and all you're going to do is that you're going to check if that property is on that function, and you say you need a lot of them. Some people would, in this scenario, copy paste all these functions and create maybe 10 of them. And that is where I think that the DRY principle makes a lot of sense, where instead of creating a bunch of functions that basically holds the exact same logic with one single property difference, it makes sense to make a higher order function that takes in that property or a property name and returns a function that does this check for you. Hopefully you'll see what I'm going with this. But on the other hand, if you have code that is very separate from, conceptually from each, if there's two pieces of code that you just by accident have very similar logic, by creating an abstraction, you are now you're breaking the coupling rule. You're creating a coupling between two pieces of code that may not actually be all that related. And you're doing that for the sake of getting abstraction. Now I know that sounds very, very fluffy, but try to just bear with me, and hopefully those of you who've been doing this for a little while will kind of be able to relate to this. But my rule of thumb is, when it comes to creating, like using the dry principle, is number one is that the code needs to be almost exactly identical, not just at the code line, like line by line. It should be almost identical, but it also has to be identical conceptually. And the second rule would be that you will have to consider, or rather, the second rule is that if you're only creating the abstraction to, or rather that you're identifying two pieces of code and you only create this abstraction in order to save yourself lines of code, then I don't think that the dry principle is applicable anymore, because like lines of code is very rarely a problem. If you have a proper loose coupling and you are following all these other principles, lines of code is very rarely the reason why a program becomes cluttered and poorly maintained, or very poorly maintained. It's usually the complexity that brings that to the table. And I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of times where lines of code is a good indicator of complexity, but it's not always the case. If you have, like, a great example of it is, take Lodash. The Lodash or underscore or whatever favorite pure function utility library you have, those functions or those files, if you go into the source code and look, like, they're humongous. Like, they're pretty large files with a lot of code in them. And what I'm trying to say here is that these are very well maintained, because if it's just a function library, it's just a file that holds that, where each function is completely pure, which means that there's no coupling between each function and the rest of the file. And that's, in my opinion, very okay, because all you really have then is a lot of lines of code in the same file, but it's still very readable and very maintainable. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Like, the first rule is, as I said, make sure that you are looking for that the logic, and not just the logic in the actual file, but conceptually it's the same thing that you are refactoring to use the dry principle. Make sure that that's the case. And the second part is, make sure that you're not just applying an abstraction to save yourself lines of code. Make sure that you're making a very sensible abstraction, otherwise you end up making your code less understandable and more complex. And trust me, all of these principles, dry, solid, etc., they're there to make the code easier, and that should be your main concern always. A principle is no good if it makes your code more complex.